Hello, my name's Jade and today we will be discussing all the books that I read in July. The first book I finished this month was Grenade Bouquets by Lee Matthew Goldberg. This is the sequel to Runaway Train, which I read a couple months ago, I believe. I'll link down below the video where I do discuss that one. I received an e-arc from the publisher, so I read this one a bit early. It doesn't come out until August, I want to say August 5th. So it's probably out by the time this video is up, let's be real. These novels both take place in the 90s. In the first one, Nico is trying to overcome the death of her sister, the grief that she's been living through. She decides to go on a road trip and she makes this little bucket list and she wants to push through it. And it's full of 90s music, grunge type references. She wants to be a singer. And I ended up enjoying Runaway Train more than I thought I would when I initially started Runaway Train. I had high hopes and then I started it and it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but then I ended up really enjoying myself and really loving this character's journey. And that was my favourite one about the second one as well. I love Nico as a character. She's so flawed and she's so real. I can see reasoning behind the mistakes she does. Again, I loved all the 90s references, loved all the music references. Similarly to the first one, I do think I wanted it to slow down a bit. In the first one, I said that I wanted to stop and smell the roses some of the time, and I think that was the case in this one. Time just kind of flies by. You don't ever see any like downtime, any like normal life with them. Well, we do, but it's tiny little snippets, and I just wanted some more of the struggle and the day-to-day life, I think. And I think this also leads to some things being told rather than shown. There are just some kind of statements. Recap things really blatantly. Emotions are just stated because we've not had enough time to see them build up in her and get them for ourselves. I mean, they're little things, but they would have made the book that much stronger in my opinion. Overall, I think I would give it a 7 out of 10. Really solid read, really enjoyed both of them, and I would definitely be open to reading more by this author in the future. The next book I read this month was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the third book in her kind of quartet. I watched an interview about her, and she said that Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones, this one, and then there'll be a fourth one, are all kind of in a companion quartet. What that means is they all take place in the same world. They take place in Hollywood, LA. That's the one. Specifically, this one takes place in Malibu, and they all look at famous women and how fame impacts them and the different kind of love that they go through. They all kind of have a focus on different types of love and relationships and how fame affects them, and they're all amazing. I loved Daisy Jones and the Six so much. I also really enjoyed Evelyn Hugo, and I really enjoyed this one as well. This one, we follow a family, and every year they throw a party. Specifically, Nina Reaver, the oldest sister, throws this party every year. This year, we're following those 24 hours of that party from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. and it ends with the house going up in flames. You find this at the very beginning of the book. It's literally not a spoiler. You know this the whole time. And I loved that concept. It kind of gave me We Were Liars vibes. No, it's not very similar. There's similarities, but in tone they're pretty different. I was worried about the actual 24 hours and how that would work out, and especially when I started reading it again, it wasn't quite going down how I expected things to go down. I think that's one of my small criticisms, is that especially in the beginning, in those 24 hours in the build of the party, we spend a really short amount of time with them because we're also kind of going back and getting the family's history and how we got to this place. But I still had so much fun reading it. I listened to the audiobook. The audiobooks for Taylor Jenkins Reid's books, the ones that I've listened to so far, are all really good. I recommend all of them. The narrator was both in Daisy Jones and the Six audiobook as well as the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo audiobook. She was smaller parts in both of those, but I love her voice. She's great. I think they're all really clever, but the clever thing in this one for me was the symbolism and how these tiny little things would come back around as the story would go on, and everything just kind of wove together so amazingly. The relationship between this family was so complex and interesting, and I felt for each and every one of them. Well, almost each and every one of them. I was really impressed by it. I think I'd give Malibu Rising a 9 out of 10. I think of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books, my favourite remains Daisy Jones and the Six, and then it's Malibu Rising, and then is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Good stuff. Next, we have a graphic novel, and that is Glass Town by Isabel Greenberg. She also wrote The 100 Nights of Hero, which I read back in January, and I adored. I loved that graphic novel so much. It's one of my favourite graphic novels, if not my favourite. So super looking forward to this one. The premise of this one is we're following the Bronte siblings, so the three sisters, Anne, Charlotte and Emily, and their brother Branwell. And as kids, they would write these stories that were in this like made up land, and it was their kind of way of playing together, creating this made up world and all the different stories that was in it. We still have fragments of it, I believe. If this sounds intriguing to you, I would definitely recommend looking it up. And this was kind of inspired by those stories. I think she did read them, but not everything happens exactly the same way. But we're also switching between timelines, because in the very beginning with Charlotte, and she's the only Bronte who's still alive, the only Bronte sibling, the rest have died. So we're also dealing with grief and the past, and there's a really strong theme of like dreams and imagination, and trying to balance living in your dreams and your imagination and living in the real world is a really strong theme in this. And it's just got a bunch of other really cool themes and ideas floating around, as her graphic novels tend to do. I just loved it. I was worried that it wouldn't live up to The 100 Nights of Hero, and I don't think I liked it as much, but I still really enjoyed it, and I love picking them apart after reading them. I love the stories overall. They're so beautiful, and they're so beautifully constructed, and there's so much thought that goes into them, and you can tell. I give it either a 9.5 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. Sounds at all interesting to you, I definitely recommend picking it up. Next, I read a play, and that is Titus and Cressida by William Shakespeare. I actually really enjoy Shakespeare. I do find him to be quite difficult. I'm one of those people that will get the modern English translations and flick between the text to make sure I at all times actually understand what's happening. Try and analyze it as I go, and like look online to find bits to help me analyze as I go. But I love analyzing Shakespeare. There's so much there, always, with its context of the period and what was happening in England at the time. So whether it's looking at what's going on in society, looking at the politics that was happening, looking at what was happening with religion, thinking about the audience and how the audience would have been reacting, and thinking about how different social classes would have reacted in different ways, because there's always so many different social classes represented in here. Look at gender, you can look at psychology, there's always so much to take away. Not even to mention the source material. A lot of the time he based his work off of other works, and he based his works off of other things, and was inspired by all sorts of stuff. Troilus and Cressida obviously being characters from the Trojan War. Troilus is a brother of Paris and Hector, and I didn't really necessarily know these characters before. I haven't read the Iliad. I've only read the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. That's the closest thing I read to the Iliad. So I had a blast getting to know some new characters, and there were one or two things that happened in here that really made me stop and think, wow, that's interesting. Why did Shakespeare choose to do that? There were a couple of things he did with Cressida. It's a tragedy, this one, so things don't end up great. A couple of things that happened with Cressida and his choices to portray her that really made me stop and go, are we being fair here, Shakespeare? Is this fair? Because I don't think it is. I had a blast going through and analysing this one, and I'm hoping to read more Shakespeare soon, because I haven't in a really long time, not since I left university, especially work based in like antiquity. So things like, I've already read Julius Caesar, but Antony and Cleopatra, I know Coriolanus I think is also set back then. He's got a few, and so I would love to read some more. I've also not read Hamlet yet, so that's a big one that I want to get to. How do I rate Shakespeare? Top 5 of the Shakespeare that I've read so far. I'd give it, I guess, on the Shakespeare scale, like a 9 out of 10, maybe. So originally in this month I was planning on reading like some summary reads, some books that I hadn't got around to yet. I had a plan. I was going to read Malibu Rising, and I was going to read Better Together by Christine Ricci, and I was going to finally get to Circe because I haven't gotten to it yet. Maybe read Sadie by Courtney Summers because I just got that book and I don't want it to sit on my bookshelf for too long. And then I read Troilus and Cressida, and things took a turn. Immediately after that, read Sappho. So Sappho is the only female ancient Greek poet that we have surviving. It might not even be poet, it might just be writer of any sorts, but don't quote me on that because I don't know. That's what I've heard. She's one of the only, if not the only, female writers from antiquity that we have surviving. Even then, it's fragmented as all heck. And so this is Mary Barnard's translation, and this stunning little book. I was reading Sappho actually for research for the novel that I'm writing, which is set in 1920s Paris, if you did not already know. It features queer culture and Sappho, and I mean Greek, Roman literature in general. For some reason the queer culture of the time were kind of obsessed with it. Sappho, the relations of lesbianism and the island of Lesbos, Sapphic literature, it's very ingrained in that society, and so I hadn't read Sappho yet and I felt like I should. I was also just interested anyway, and I adored this, and it's set me off on a whole new obsession. I definitely want to look into Sappho herself more, because we don't know a lot and there's a lot of speculation around her, but there are little bits and bobs that we think we do know. I say we. I know nothing. I read the introduction and the afterwards of this and other book that you will see shortly. And so she has this mysterious quality to her that I think makes her even more intriguing and exciting and makes me look up to her in a whole other way. She writes a lot about love, and the way she does it is really great. I think this edition is one that kind of stitches bits of broken text a little bit together a little bit and kind of fills in some of the blanks. Because it's so fragmented, some people will leave the blanks, some people try to guess what she's saying, some people try and fill in the rest of the poems. There's lots of different ways of translating her because it's so broken. I think this is one that kind of tries to fix it up a little bit, but I thought the writing was just so stunning. 10 out of 10. And so between Titus and Cressida and my reading of Sappho, I then ditched the whole summer reading, catching up on books, reading fun summery books, and went down a deep dark hole. The next book I read was actually non-fiction, and that is Pandoras Jar by Natalie Haynes. This intrigued me the moment I heard about it. Women in the Greek myths. So the premise behind this is Natalie Haynes takes these women in Greek myth that we either have kind of forgotten or that we've villainized, and we kind of don't interpret them in the way that they originally were in antiquity, or maybe in the way that we should. Maybe they're not given a fair, shout. She takes 10 of these women, breaks down why we forgot them, why they're misrepresented, how we should maybe view them, other interpretations that are there, how maybe things have changed over time. And she often does refer to both art from antiquity and artwork throughout the ages, up until modern times, with things like Wonder Woman is referenced in here when she talks about the Amazons. Buffy's referenced in here. I can't remember why or when, but she is. And it's so rich because you have the history, and then you have the comparisons to modern day artwork, and then you have the olden day artwork and how things have changed over time. And there's just so much happening, and I learned so much reading this, and I loved getting to learn about some of these women that I hadn't learned about before, or viewing some of these women in new and interesting ways. I listened to the audiobook and I put on the sample just to kind of get a taste of it while I started doing something else, and it ended and I was like, wait, what? I immediately bought it and proceeded to plow through it until I finished. Natalie Haynes narrates it herself, and I loved listening to her narration. It felt like going back and listening to a friend, but a really interesting, funny, is really funny as well. Really interesting, funny friend who has so much rich stuff to say. I just adored it. It was so good. It's definitely my favorite book that I read this month. I love the cover as well. I think it's stunning. Highly recommend if it at all sounds interesting to you. And so from there, I went to Sophocles, who was an ancient Greek tragedian playwright. I read Antigone in university, my first year of university, and I always meant to read the other ones and to kind of read more ancient texts because I've always wanted to, and it's just one of those things that I never got around to doing it. And I knew that I wanted to read the book that I read after this next, and so I decided to delve into the Oedipus stories and try and find as many as I could relating to Oedipus and start from there and then work my way to other stories and such. So I read Antigone, Oedipus the King, and Electra. Oedipus the King is obviously a very famous myth. Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, Antigone are kind of a trilogy in that they follow the same story chronologically, although they weren't chronologically performed at all. Antigone actually came first, which is the last one. But for the sake of our imaginations and our understanding, you can kind of look at them as a trilogy, as a set. They're all Theban. So Antigone and Oedipus the King obviously relate to each other. Electra is actually about that other trilogy I referenced, the Oresteia, the story of when Agamemnon comes home from the Trojan War. I really enjoyed this. I found it to be really accessible and easy to read. I found it to be fairly quick to read. I really loved the verse. I much prefer reading translations to verse than prose, although sometimes they're just too difficult to translate to verse and they have to translate them to prose. Antigone is easily my favourite. I think the themes and the ideas in there are so interesting, and I love trying to think about what's going on in Antigone's head. We don't actually get that many lines from her compared to other characters, especially Creon, her uncle, so she's not even really the main character. Ismene is also in this one, and she has very little lines, and I think looking at her and her relationship with Antigone is fascinating. And then Oedipus the King would come second in my book. It's such a famous story. It's so interesting. If you don't know the story before going into it, go into it blind. You will love it. There are copious amounts of dramatic irony, which is fun, but also it gets to the point like, okay, we get it. It felt a little bit clumsy, but I'm sure it's just a style that I'm not used to. And I'm really glad to have read it. I would give Antigone like 5 stars, Oedipus the King 4 stars, and then I think I'd give Electra like 3 stars. It's probably my least favourite of the trilogy, but again, I still enjoyed it. I think Sophocles, from what I'm getting so far, he does relationships really well. It's really interesting to interrogate what's going on there and how people are actually feeling about one another. I mean, it was also hard for me because after reading Pandora's Jar, I have so much emotion for Clytemnestra, and seeing her depicted as this bad guy just like hurts me a little bit. But it's still 3 or 4 stars. I still enjoyed it, and it was by no means like a disappointment compared to the other two. It still stands up, I think. And then we have The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes, the same author of Pandora's Jar. She's also written 1,000 Ships, which I think is maybe her more famous novel, and that retells the Iliad from the women's perspective. This one, however, follows The Children of Jocasta as well as Jocasta and Oedipus. Jocasta is Oedipus's wife from Oedipus the King, hence why I started going down a bit of a binge of reading all sorts of different Oedipus plays. Oh, I maybe should mention very quickly that I also read Oedipus by Seneca. Seneca's version, I didn't like it as much. He went on a lot about nature. Nature was really big in his, and he would go on these really big tangents about nature, and things happened really slowly for the first 3 acts, and then all of a sudden things just kind of started going in the last 2 for me, and I found it quite slow and difficult to read because of that. I maybe need to give it another shot. I would love to kind of compare it to the original Oedipus the King a little bit more and see what I think, but I did also read that version. Anyway, back to this. So we follow Jocasta and Ismene. Jocasta is the wife of Oedipus, and her story kind of really gets forgotten in Oedipus the King because she is a really integral part of the story. She has very few lines. We don't give her credit where credit is due. Similar enough with Ismene and Antigone. She's not necessarily portrayed in the her position in that one is difficult. From an ancient audience, I'm sure her position was very respectable. She believes that because she's a woman, she can't fight the will of a man, the orders of a man, a king nonetheless. But as a modern audience, you look back and you think, Ismene, what are you doing? And we see the story from her perspective. I'd say more so than Jocasta's. We're in first person Ismene's perspective, whereas we're in third person Jocasta's. We switch back and forth between the timeline of Ismene's timeline and then Jocasta's timeline before the children were born and stuff, kind of, for the most part. I, again, really enjoyed this. It's one that's inspired by the myth rather than directly retells. It's much more grounded than the original myth. And because of that, it's kind of surprising. I know where the cards are gonna land because it is the Oedipus story, but how they're gonna get there, I don't know, because things just kind of started happening differently. And I was like, wow, so what's gonna happen? And she fills in some of the blanks that are left in the original plays because they're only tiny slithers of these people's lives, really. And just being in these women's heads was so interesting and fascinating, and this different take on the story I really enjoyed. The writing was really nice. I loved her descriptions of the world around them. It felt really concrete and real to me. Biggest thing that annoyed me about it, having finished the book, because this wasn't so much a problem during reading it, is that these characters don't necessarily feel like fully flushed people to me. And I've been going back and forth on this a lot because they didn't in the originals either, so do they have to? Is it kind of a stylistic choice maybe to follow in the tradition of what came before? Creon, I don't especially 100% understand why he did what he did, and that frustrates me because it's so integral to the story. But I spent the whole of yesterday just like going around circles, arguing with myself, trying to figure it out. So I don't know. I haven't decided. I can't decide if I respect that or if it just does frustrate me a little bit. I think I could easily give it a 9 out of 10. I enjoyed it that much. I just don't think it's a 10 out of 10 because of that little bit of hesitation, but I still really enjoyed it. I still think it's a very interesting adaptation of the myth, and if you are interested in the myth and you haven't read this, I would highly suggest it. I'm just recommended loads today. Next, I read If Not Winter by Anne Carson, which is fragments of Sappho. I was so obsessed that I had to read another version because I was pretty sure that that version had filled in the blanks after researching a little bit. This version is super interesting in that on one side we get the ancient Greek, which obviously I can't read ancient Greek, but it's nice to have. And then we have the translation on this side. And what this means, if I could show you a different example, is you can see the way it's laid out in the Greek, and then you can see directly how it'd be laid out in English. And I don't know if you can see, but there's all these kind of like little brackets, and that means there's a blank space there. It shows you that she's not kind of filling in any of the gaps, and she's also showing you where the gaps are. She writes about this in her introduction, and that it kind of leaves this blank space for you to imagine what was there. It's full of possibility and mystery and excitement. I don't think I necessarily enjoyed it as much as the other one, just because it is so fragmented. It can be a little bit hard to kind of try and understand what she's reading, and because I'm so new to it, I found it a little bit hard, but it's definitely something that I'm going to go back to. I still really appreciate this edition. I think I'd give it maybe an 8, 9 out of 10. Definitely something that I think as I learn more about Sappho and I learn more about her poetry, this is an edition that I'm really going to value. Next, after reading Children of Jocasta, wasn't sure what I wanted to read, and a couple days ended up going by where I just didn't really read anything, and I was kind of panicking as to what I should read, and I just randomly picked up Find Me by Andre Aciman. This is the sequel of Call Me By Your Name, which I also read in university and loved. And I bought this pretty soon after. In fact, after university, I took a specific class where I read loads of good books. I read Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I read The Hate You Give by Andre Thomas. Call Me By Your Name. Lullaby by Leila Slimani. And I'm missing one. Oh, The Girls by Emma Cline. And I loved all 5 of those books, and afterwards I wanted to read more from all authors, so I bought Normal People by Sally Rooney, I bought Adele by Leila Slimani, and I bought Find Me by Andre Aciman, and then proceeded to not read any of them for years. And I've since read both Normal People and Adele, so this was the only one waiting for me. Finally read it. It's interesting as a sequel because they feel very separate. It does follow on from Call Me By Your Name, but not necessarily from Elio and Oliver straight away. The first section, to forewarn you, is from Elio's father's perspective, and so it's more about the fallout of what happened to all 3 of these characters, and we do follow quite a big expanse of time in this one, and years, quite a few years have gone by since the end of Call Me By Your Name, and so it has a very different tone. And I've heard a lot of mixed reviews, and I don't think that this is a bad thing, the fact that this book feels so different from the original book, because it's still a solid book. They're just different. Keep that in mind maybe if you've not read this yet and you love Call Me By Your Name and you are thinking about reading it. I listened to the audiobook, which is actually narrated by the actor who plays Elio's dad in the movie. Solid audiobook, really quick listen, and I think there's something about his writing that when it's read aloud just comes to life. It's so musical and lyrical that I really feel like it works best when it's read aloud. When I tried reading Call Me By Your Name the first time, I didn't listen to the audiobook and I was really struggling, and then all of a sudden I turned on the audiobook and everything started clicking together for me. It expands on some of the themes that are introduced in the first book. I remember thinking and analysing that time was quite big in the first book, and time is really big in here. And there are just a lot of really interesting ideas and concepts and themes. I cannot emphasise how interesting they were and how enthralled I was reading this. I was expecting to kind of think it was okay, fine and fun read and accept it for what it was. I wasn't expecting it to affect me, and it did. So I think I'd give it like a 9 out of 10. I can't give it any lower if nothing else because it was so clever. Watching how their story played out, and it played out I think in a really real way. Things don't always come together really quickly. Things take time sometimes, and I think this is a realistic depiction of that. I think also a relatively hopeful depiction. Yeah, I really enjoyed it in the end. Okay, 2 more. Next up is Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera and Celia Moscote. This is an adaptation of the book Juliet Takes a Breath, which I have not read, and I think I can definitely tell that it was an adaptation. Felt as if things happened a lot quicker than they might have in the book, and that we had kind of sections just completely pulled out that I'm hoping were in the book, where we like are going on this journey with her. So it's following Juliet, who is queer. She identifies as a lesbian, and She comes from a Puerto Rican family living in the Bronx who don't kind of accept that, and she goes away for a summer internship to work for a character who I cannot remember the name of for the life of me, but is an author of a feminist novel all about empowering women, particularly queer women. She goes on an internship to get enough credits, I think, to go to college. I believe it's a little, for me, it went by a little quickly, and there were chunks taken, at least it feels like there were chunks taken out that I needed, and there were times where I was even confused as to what was happening. Like, it felt like we'd met a character before that we actually had never met before, but the way Juliet was responding to them felt like we had met them before, and I was just a bit confused, and I wanted things to slow down a little bit. I actually picked it up because of the art style. I flicked through it in a shop and just thought it was so stunning, and the art is stunning. I love the colour palette for this. And it does have a lot of really important and relevant themes about racism and about how people identify in terms of gender and sexuality. It feels like it could be really educating on that. Again, this version just kind of blurred past it really quickly, but I would anticipate that the novel did a better job, maybe. I want to love it because I love everything that it stands for, and I'm really interested in the story, but I feel like I didn't really get all of it. I can't give it any higher than a 7 out of 10. Finally, the last thing I read this month was Euripides, Orestes and Other Plays. My dog has scratched up. I don't know if you can tell. I'm very upset about it, but I really enjoy this artwork. My attention is always drawn to it. This contains Ion, Orestes, Phoenician women and suppliant women. Phoenician women is kind of an alternative version of what I believe the Seven Against Thebes by Aeschylus is. I haven't read that one yet. It takes place after Oedipus at Colonus, but again, they're not actually connected or even written by the same person, but they follow the same overall story. And it's a version in which things end differently at the end of Oedipus the King. And so because of that, it was really interesting following that one and seeing this different version. Suppliant Woman takes place after the Seven Against Thebes. It looks at the fallout of mothers, these dead people who they're not allowed to bury, and this is a really important thing in ancient Greece. That one is actually like a political drama or something, and so there's a lot of talk about whether democracy is better or whether having one strong ruler is better, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. They just kind of go off on a tangent, and I found that really interesting. Orestes is a version from the Oresteia story. This one takes place at the very end when Orestes is kind of trying to deal with everything that he's done, and that's actually what this artwork is from. It's the Furies plaguing him. And then Ion is something that I've never heard of that story before, and we follow a woman who was raped by Apollo and put the child that she bore as a consequence. She kept it a secret and she put them in the cave where she was raped, and then when she goes back, they're gone. So Apollo moved him and gave him to the priestess of his temple to bring up, and it's them now meeting, not knowing that they're mother and son, and it looks a lot at the fallout of this rape. I feel like I need to go back through and analyse it some more. I don't think I got the fullness of it yet, but I'm so pumped to. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed this perspective of a woman openly kind of saying that the gods did wrong. These were my first Euripides plays, and they are translated into prose because they're too difficult to translate into verse, and that did slow me down a little bit. I did find them a little heavier because of that, but I'm still really excited to go back through and analyse them. I haven't really done that. I only kind of wrote my initial notes as I was going through them. If I had to give them an order, I think Ion and Phoenician Women would be at the top, and then Orestes and Suppliant Women would come second. I enjoyed all of them, so it's hard to kind of say which ones were my favourites. I'd give the collection as a whole an 8 out of 10. And those were all of the books that I read this month. So that's 2 graphic novels, 4 novels, 1 non-fiction, 2 collections of poetry, and 9 plays total. It was a busy month. If you've read any of these and you have any thoughts on them, please let me know down below. If not, let me know what your favourite book you read this month was. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an awesome morning, afternoon, evening / night. My name's Jade. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye!